to think about that when you design a world like this. Like, if you've had a lot of cultural movement, how would that affect the culture that's there, even in a fantasy setting? There we go. There's the Danube region. As we see, it starts up a little bit west of Augsburg in Germany, and then it goes all the way over into Moldavia. So we see that it tracks through this variety of cultures, with the names greatly changing from things that we more or less recognize, like Augsburg, Munich, Vienna. Then there's Brela, Galatia, Creuva. I'm probably not pronouncing this correctly. And we see that the names become less and less anglicized, and they definitely take on a more Balkan tone as it goes further east. Danube was in France. No, Danube does not flow through France. That it does not do. It starts out in Germany, and then it goes east through Czech Republic and Austria and whatnot. So even if your real world geography is not really high, I mean, you can learn a lot just by looking at a map and looking at kind of cultural distributions and mapping distributions and geographic distributions, and that can really inform a fantasy world. And I think that's the single best thing, biggest takeaway that you'll probably get from this is everything I've done so far. I've spent a lot of time looking at real world histories and geographies. And so how this region generally stacks up to this. I mean, there's some almost inevitable crossover in terms of the makeup of the region that I'm representing. And again, the size of it is in the time period of it is approximately, well, the time period of it's approximately Charlemagne's empire, and the scale of it is approximately Germany over to the Ukrainian border, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. So I essentially lifted some real world elements to inform this game and to inform the mapping choices. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any kind of modern military map, or surveillance map, or naval maps, exactly, are definitely useful in determining things like that. So let's go on to the second world. Maybe this time I'll remember to show you the maps in order. So we'll go and talk about, so the Blight Realms game, as I said, it's mostly written in a fairly advanced document form, and there are some reasons why it has not come to light yet, and we're still hoping that it'll at some point come to light. But that for right now is not the project I'm primarily working on. The project I'm primarily working on is Tales of the Heart of Land, set in the world of Asfalna. And on the webpage, there's the brief write-up about the world. So those are the new kingdoms. This is the landmass, the known inhabited land of Asfalna as the game starts. As I said, I kind of frame it in terms of a starting area. And it's approximately 900 kilometers in length from north to south, and about half that at its widest point. And it's a bit larger than Germany, and similarly proportioned. And it's actually closer to the size of the state of Montana. And it's smaller. It's a smaller portion of a much larger continental landmass. But I opted to make this a focused area so I could explore it deeply and realistically. And it also feeds into the narrative of a re-emerging civilization that has been confined through catastrophe to this smaller area. Absolutely. So the naval maps that you're talking about, that they're a great way to determine population density. And that'll be modern population density, which is not to say you can't kind of assume that based on human migration for a large part of our history, we've tended to try to live near the same areas because of transportation, food, and all that. I decided to go a little further back than the late medieval era, and I had it in my mind that the feel of this world would be something like the Mesopotamian era Fertile Crescent region. And I began to kind of envision this and what we think of as far as the makeup, the physical makeup of the land, the way people made things, what resources were there to be utilized. And I started to look at the Fertile Crescent historical maps and other regions that show large areas of land that are flat, farmable, and mostly fields fed by rivers and ringed by hills and highlands. And for that, I'll actually go to the proper map. So this is a map of the early Mesopotamian fertile culture region. And we see at its center, there is this large planar area. And that at one point was all very fertile and very lush marshland that a lot of farming went on in. Now, the New Kingdoms has a large forest on its western border. And this is where it departs from the Mesopotamian region. But this is a relatively new growth, and it's rooted in the world's lore as being fed by supernatural energy. And I do have the mountains that kind of typically seem to ring these areas. I found some inspiration on the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea that would have bordered Mesopotamia and that largely fed the marshes and fields with brackish water. So I've kind of incorporated that into the game. In much like Mesopotamia, the coastline is very marshy with really ancient settlements. Because, of course, people would tend to settle and build near their sources of food and near sources of transport. And to the north and south of the continental kingdom are these like really craggy, vast mountain ranges that further create kind of logical natural borders. So one of the most useful things that came out of mapping, particularly this land, is it gives you the chance to create unique geographic features that lend to the personality of the world. You can have a dozen woodlands named the Witchwood or the Grand Forest, but most of those won't be memorable, right? Because we've heard those all before. They'll be just like every other fantasy world. And even if you have strange creatures or strangely colored fauna or something else to set it apart, for the most part, you're going to tend to see this being iterations of the worlds that we saw before. And when I talk about unique geographies, I'm talking about places with an internal mythology that is set in the world and that is tied to the cultures of the world. And they don't have to be dramatic and vast. They don't have to be giant mystery basalt craters or deserts in the middle of an otherwise lush field. One of the examples from Tales of the Hallowed Land that I have is this cliff line that if you, and it's hard to see on this little screen, but if you go and take a look at the map on the website, on the eastern coast, there are steep rocky limestone cliffs that descend abruptly down into the sea. And these were based on the cliffs of the Elbe River, which is one of the natural borders of Germany and the Czech Republic. They're called the Bastia, and they're massive natural rock pillars that have formed from years and years and years of deposits. And I have some pictures of those as well. I've never seen these in person, but I really want to. And they're huge and they go on for miles. this is and they tend to be clustered. But these are some actual images of what inspired me to create that landscape feature. So I decided these cliffs were going to be called the Kiri, and unlike the Bastille in the real world, they go on for quite a long time, and they form over, excuse me, they form over a flatland That's the coastal flatland. And so they've also created these really almost labyrinthine valleys and gulches. And they may have had various names over the years, but the Miluk people, who are the plain horse culture and herding culture, have called it the Kiri over the last 700 or 800 years. They're the indigenous people of the Great Plains, and it comes from the Miluk phrase meaning to wander. And I imagine that similarly to the Bastille, there would be these deep, narrow canyons and gulches within the stone pillars. And these would be things that you could kind of wander through, these kind of maze-like rock valleys that you could wander through. And I kind of hint that the Melek also believed that their dead, who could not return to a spiritual ancestral land, would wander these passages. And I also designated that there are strange, rare creatures that live there, kind of a hyena-wolf hybrid. So it makes these areas a little dangerous to traverse. But there's also rumored to be a lot of lost places, like abandoned cliff dwellings, made by people who live there even further back than the Melek, that are within the valleys and the peaks of this region. And unlike the Bastille, the Kiri aren't an isolated cluster of pillars rising out of the dense woods. They border plains to the west, north and south, and then the east is seaward. And I kind of pictured them dropping off like the cliffs of Dover. So I have this sort of kind of dual vision of what they would look like, that they would be these kind of cliffs that at the top of the cliffs would be rising up these amazing pillars of rock. And so this gave me this opportunity to not only create this memorable geographic feature, but tie it to the world's lore. And all of this came out of researching real life examples. This didn't just pop into my mind because I'm a creative genius or anything like that. I was doing quite a bit of reading on river structures, and I came across pictures of the Bastille, and I thought they were so striking that I wanted to kind of say, all right, I want to add these into my game somehow, but like, what role are they going to serve? So I rooted them to the cultures, and I rooted them to the history of the place as well. Take another shot of those. So, I really wanted mountains to have personality in this world. And I talk about the Great Plains and the Magra Peninsula in the first video, and how I kind of developed that and created these own kind of internal ecosystems and histories. But there is the Triager, who are it's on the western edge of the New Kingdoms, or mountain range on the western edge of the New Kingdoms, and they're loosely based on the Alps. They're really highly peaked, rising out of the plains to the east and the Great Forest to the west. Here's a map of the Alps as they cut off the Italian peninsula from Germany, Switzerland, the rest of Northern Europe and Western Europe. But I decided that these places would have been inhabited, this place would have been inhabited for a very long time. And they contain remnant cultures that survived the infestation. The infestation is part of the back history of this world due to their isolation. And the nearest modern population center is in Akarth, which is ruled by a kind of decayed culture, imperial culture called the Hapshar, who aren't originally native to it. And I envision this being this kind of Iron Age fantasy city that's somewhere between like historical Lucerne and Melniboné in tone. This kind of decaying and dark place that it would be similar in geography to Lucerne, being set in the Alps, but then it would have that kind of, rusting out hulk of grandeur. And these peaks seem to rise directly out of the plain when they're viewed at a distance. So they're huge. They tower up. They're one of the main features. There are three sisters. The tallest spires of the Triager Mountains tower above all the other lower mountains. And I decided to name these peaks and give them some personality. So I called them Elaf, Vinda, and Arusu. And Vinda is the highest peak. at 6,000 meters. Elaf stands at 49,000 meters. And Arusu is the shortest sibling at 22,000 meters. And it's a story that these mountains are giant monument stones to fallen gods and goddesses who are known by those names. And there are high caves in the peaks, sometimes with reportedly strange undying guardians that watch over shrines and other supernatural places that could be ventured to. And they have a base of white limestone, and they're striated with purple and green hues from rich mineral and gemstone deposits. But only the bases have ever been mined extensively. So there's still these really tall, rich mountains that can be explored. And I took some inspiration from the Matterhorn, which inspired Caladris, as well as Mount Blanc, Liscum, and the other famous alpine peaks. The foothills to the east are arid and windswept with bony trees, and they eventually flatten into the Great Plains. And then to the west is the lushly forested area that just kind of creeps out and creeps into the mountainside. And the goal in all these choices was to create landscape with real personality. And I've considered each of the major geographic regions tied to the lore of the land's history. And most importantly, their culture and their people. So there's kind of this inevitable question that comes in. Why do we have to do this? Do we have to do this? Are most players perfect 6,000 meters fan? Yeah, 60 kilometers. Yeah, so, and by the way, I did actually research. All right, see you later, Justin. I did actually research 6,000 meters, not 60,000. If I said 60,000, I was mistaken. Sorry. That is too large. Yeah, it's too large. But I tried to base them around some of the higher peaks within the Alps. I kind of did that intentionally to give it some sense of realism. And I saw quite a few pictures of the Alps from different angles, and they just seem to just tower up. And I've been on the outskirts of the Alps. I've never been deep in the Alps, but I haven't been close enough to really see some of the famous peaks. But it is kind of amazing when you suddenly realize you're standing amidst these mountains, and there's even more giant mountains nearby. Oh yeah, I think I totally misread that. Yeah. So it's supposed to be 6,000 meters, 4,900 meters, and 2,200 meters. If I said 22,000, then I misspoke. Oops. Yeah. So they're definitely smaller than that. No, that was a good catch. Because somebody would catch me on it. I'd start getting nasty emails in a thread. No, they're not that big. But that segues perfectly into what I'm about to talk about. See? I meant to do that. Why not make something completely outrageous like 60,000 meter mountains, right? Like, why not create something completely fantastic? Why go through this trouble of creating this environment that's so rooted into your world and into your world history? And I think that's this isn't a right or wrong. As I said last game, I don't base these talks, I don't base my world building on this is the right way to do it, you should all do this. It's just what I found to be very helpful to make convincing worlds. And why not make a giant donut-shaped landmass around an endless abyss or chasm or lake? Why not make a land with strange floating rock platforms? 6,000 meter mountain. Yeah, exactly, right. Why not make lands with mysterious floating rock platforms with cities built on them? Like real high fantasy. Why not? You can do that. I mean, there's certain magical environments, especially in Dungeons and Dragons, like a magical dungeon or the Underdark, where it quite intentionally is alien, you know? You can fully embrace this whole magical opinion of a world's working and have features that are irrational or impossible. Well, right. So there's one thing. If you have absolutely authentic medieval towns and in medieval settings, it's going to be pretty boring, right? Because at its core, medieval life was alternately horrible or boring. There were very few spaces in between. So yeah, this is still a fantasy game. But why not make it so completely high fantasy? Yeah, he makes butter. Yeah, this is Bob the Younger. He also makes butter. Exactly. And that's if you wanted to create a realistic medieval game, your players would be butter churners and and cow farmers. If they're lucky, they'd have cows. They probably have chickens and goats. So at the same time, I think it's much more difficult to sell players or to sell a broader audience on this completely outrageous and magical world. And if it's not important to you, if it doesn't matter that it's not at all intrinsically believable, then that's cool. Hey, maybe your land of floating platforms are, are exactly what your players want. That's great. But I find for my own writing, I'd rather make something that is believable and deep and a little memorable in that regard. That you have the ability to kind of separate this, because magic. Why is this there? Because magic. Do you have the ability to separate that out and actually do something that digs in deeper in terms of the game environment, in terms of the game world? So, again, I think this is a totally personal decision, but I just thought that I would share what the steps I take and the research I go into to start thinking about how to make a world inherently convincing and how to place cultures within it that make the landscape memorable. That make it memorable not because it's outrageous and because it's kind of a gotcha weird moment, but because it is in fact something that it can be related to in terms of that world's core mythology. And as I always say, do what you and your players find believable and exciting. There's no reason to not make, strange fantasy landscapes if that's what you and your players want. But I'm taking the approach with this series that maybe you want something that is slightly more grounded. So I like grounding a world in sort of primary colors. And that's a good way to think of it. What's the palette of your world? So the palette of the world is really interesting because for Blight Realms, the palette of my world was reds and oranges to the east, brown and dust, very much like a paint with elements, right? I specifically envisioned it almost like an Old West setting or a post-apocalyptic setting, how you'd envision those. And then right to the west, though, are these lush forests and fields. And these people kind of going about their life more or less divorced from this supernatural horror that has, more or less, except for the immigrants that they hear, the stories they hear. Also, it's notable that both worlds are very human-centric. For the Tales of the Hallowed Land, I wanted it to feel green and brown and black, like marshes. Like pretty much the bulk of the world has this tone and this feel that it's this vast plain that's damp and temperate. And occasionally you get these massive storms through it. But then there are these areas just to the west that have really lush growth, and the mountains would have these striking colors. Well, and the idyllic spot from the two rivers in from the two rivers in Wheel of Time to the Shire. I mean, these are all to Luke's farm on Tatooine. These are all these. This is kind of that off the farm. Like, do you have that off the farm moment? Like and this perhaps is another whole discussion. And in the world of Harrows for Blight Realms, the farm has been leveled, right? Like everyone knows the farm was nearly leveled or has been leveled, and there are pockets where people have managed to maintain this sense of normalcy, but everybody knows that nothing is normal. You know, there are literally, you know, watchtower lines set up to keep these living dead things and these other kind of undead supernatural creatures at bay. So if you're right on the border there, it is very much this kind of, you know, frontier wasteland feel. For the Tales of the Harrowed Land, it's very high fantasy, sword and sorcery, and it has a little bit more of a decadent feel. It's either very rustic or very decadent. Right. Right. There's that sense, and especially in the first game, there's that sense that this piece is going to crumble at any moment. The conflicts in Tales of the Harrowed Land tend, at least among the existing remnant cultures, to be more political and social. And again, I've got a lot to say about that, so we'll keep that for somewhere else. But part of that is because of the geography they're stuck in. There is this interesting dynamic of what people need from each other to trade. So there's been less of this, and not to mention the fact that people have armies there and people have military forces, but there has not been this chance for these re-emerging cultures to develop very vast military displays. Unlike in Blight Realms, where there are several very typical feudal city-states that have standing armies and cavalry and all knights and all those things you expect in that kind of fantasy world. So we're working on a couple different. You guys are working on a couple different worlds. You were already saying. What else do you think? What else do you think you might end up doing with some of your game, your world? What have you been doing to work on it and flesh it out? And again, I'm talking about in my videos that I'm dealing with here. I'm talking about building the world content from the ground up. It's also a little different. Like when I run Greyhawk, I take Greyhawk and I've done a lot of work in putting in my own places, my own little bits of history. But I've kept the form of Greyhawk pretty much as it was written, largely because that's still just one of my favorite classic game settings. Where do you all start when you build a world? I'm curious to get some feedback on that. Huh. Okay, I don't know that game. I don't know that series. So that's yeah. So that's always an interesting exercise, taking this kind of known popular world and how do you make a game out of it? How do you make it playable, right? In this sort of game setting, this sort of game environment. I don't know if that's backwards. I mean, I kind of talk about that a little bit at the beginning of the video, that I think the stories you want to tell are what should actually shape your world map. Right? Like, I originally envisioned Blight Realms as, you know, the zombie apocalypse world. And I went through, like I said, like, I had to be a dozen sketches of world maps. And I was like, well, what would make sense for this to really work? So I wanted it to be this horror setting. I wanted it to be this kind of desperate sense. Okay. Taking an interest in folks. Okay. Yeah, I don't think, Nostradang it, I don't think you are at all backwards. I think that's kind of the way I would think about it. Because I think the geography can kind of write itself, like when you come up with a geopolitical spread. So let's see. I'm just reading it as it comes up. Religion is a whole other topic. I'm not even going to get into that here. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great way to do it because already you started defining your landmass based upon the priorities and the cultures that live there, and that's kind of how I think you should do it. So how are his mapping skills? How's the younger brother's mapping skills? Or the prince's mapping skills? Right, exactly. So Adam, yeah, it's broad. Yeah, broad. Well, we talked a little bit about religion and zealotry from my other chat. That's such a difficult topic with these worlds because if they're a medieval European analog, if you have this monolithic entity, it could be, yeah, that could cause his skills to lack a little. Death does that, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe he can dictate it to his ancestors. All right, his grandson, being a coastal and seagoing sort, probably has a much greater idea of what the land actually looks like. As far as classes that hinge on religion, yeah, so that's something that we discussed very deeply in terms of Blight Realms when we were designing it. And Adam, you played Blight Realms. That's the game you played. The playtest stuff. We definitely did not want it. Definitely didn't want clerics. Like that's such a holdover from a church institution or religious institution. We wanted to have people that could do things. And maybe they'd attribute it to gods or goddesses or some other supernatural agent.